Welcome back to the afternoon session of the 2020 Virtual Railroad Environmental Conference. I'm Kevin Keller with HCR. I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. We have a bunch of really good presentations. As you heard Dr. Barkin say earlier, we had a lot of abstracts to look over and to select. And so even though they were all very good, this afternoon, I think, from my personal perspective, are the best of the best. So we're going to start out with a highlight, at least a highlight to me of every Railroad Environmental Conference that I think we've had, and that's Mr. Bob Fronczak with the AAR. And Bob always gives us a lightning round of environmental issues that are affecting North American railroads today and in the near future. I think most of y'all know Bob, but Bob's currently the AVP of Environment and Hazardous Materials for the Association of American Railroads. He's been there for quite a while. His responsibilities include development, coordination of the railroad industry environmental policy, and as you can imagine, that's not an easy job. It's herding cats a lot of the time for Bob. Bob is a former railroader. He spent a lot of time with the Milwaukee Road in Chicago. He's also been in the consulting side of the business with Radian Corporation in Milwaukee. So Bob's a good friend, and I'm sure we're all anxious to hear what he's got to say. So Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin. And I guess I'd like to just say hello to all the people out there. Hope you're all healthy and staying safe. It's been a very strange time. Hopefully next year we'll be able to see each other again. I'm going to cover the issues affecting North American railroads. I'm going to cover some of the things that the Environmental Affairs Committee have worked on, sometimes in coordination with the environmental lawyers. But tomorrow, my colleague Teresa Romanowski is going to cover some of the stuff that the environmental attorneys have been up to. So you're going to get two presentations this year. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is the multi-sector general stormwater permit. There's some treated wood issues, which you've heard about before a little bit. There's a couple of other state issues that I'd like to talk about. California emissions is always a big issue for us, and then get into the environmental awards program. The big thing that we did in 2020 was the responding to the multi-sector general permit, which was published in March of this year. Comments were due May 1st, extended to June 1st, and we filed 135 pages of comments to that draft permit, which is the most extensive comment that I think I've ever been involved with in my 26 years at AAR. Just wanted to cover some of the major points that we made. Number one, there's a notification and eligibility requirement for the use of cationic treatment chemicals. We're telling EPA that we don't think that should be added to the actual permit conditions. We use cationic chemicals. As a matter of fact, I worked for Nalco Chemical. I sold those chemicals for a while. It's very common for removing suspended solids from wastewater, and if they do have any sort of requirement, we feel like it should just be part of the SWIP and not part of the permit. There's a signage requirement for public notice of coverage under the permit. We don't think that ought to be a requirement. It should be a guideline instead of a requirement. We don't want people standing outside our fences. Their intermodal facilities have a lot of truck traffic going in and out, could be very unsafe. We don't think that's a good idea or should be necessary. We think it's inappropriate for EPA to impose requirements on enhanced controls to minimize potential impacts of excessive flooding. That was part of the draft permit. We don't think that's based on quality of facility discharges, and it doesn't adhere to adaptive management principles contained in the MSGP. Instead, they should issue guidance related to enhanced controls to minimize the impacts of excessive flooding. Of course, that's becoming more of an issue with global climate. Sector P has only been subject to visual inspection monitoring since the initial permit in 1995. And, we think that the rail industry should be considered a low-risk industry and, be part of the inspection-only option, which was offered in the permit without any sort of benchmark monitoring. If benchmark monitoring is required, and right now it's required for all sectors for pH, chemical oxygen demand, and total suspended solids, it should be, as presented in the National Research Council study, which only required informational quarterly monitoring for 1 year, and we don't think it should lead to any additional implementation measures, which other benchmark values are subject to. So that's something that we would like to avoid. And I'll explain that a little bit more. EPA should not require the railroad industry to monitor for lead and mercury. Lead and mercury is not really something that is, something used in the rail industry. That's something that you would normally see in a mining operation, metals in a mining operation for, say, copper or aluminum, something like that. There's no indication that lead and mercury are concerns in Sector P, and the NRC study conducted for Sector P didn't mention lead or mercury as potential contaminants for our sector. So, it seems like EPA's relying on historical toxic release inventory reporting and not what is typically at a Sector P type facility. So we would like to see those requirements removed from the permit. If benchmarks are monitored, any benchmark imposed must reflect a minimum level of effluent quality that is attainable using demonstrated technology. So best available control technology. If you can't remove it, you're just imposing additional costs for no good reason. If benchmarks are to be monitored, the benchmark limits for many of the parameters need to be adjusted to higher concentrations that reflect the stormwater flow conditions. In other words, there is oftentimes water coming from offsite, which is not industrial water, but still have elevated benchmark values. And we think that ought to be factored into the stormwater permit. And there's a national stormwater quality database that has what those levels ought to be. PAH's benchmark should not be included in the final permit, absent additional justification and further notice and comment. The NRC report noted that information should be gathered in order to potentially correlate PAHs with COD, but it didn't say that they should actually, require that. So, we're, I guess, voting on the side of the National Research Council on that issue. Facility changes should not trigger the alternative implementation measures for Tier 1. If you're going to have such a requirement, that should be part of the stormwater pollution prevention plan. It basically is already, so we don't feel like that should be part of the actual permit requirements. And again, we feel like we should support detailed, extensive stormwater data in that National Stormwater Quality Database for characterizing background pollutant concentrations. It assigns sampling locations to 8 land use categories, which also are broken into additional destinations of mixed land use, such as commercial, residential. And again, if there are residential contributions being, discharged onto a railroad facility, that ought to be factored into the benchmark monitoring values. We looked at the cost that EPA estimated for the draft permit. They estimated $3.6 million, and we estimated $465 million if all of the provisions of the permit were adopted. So there's a major cost differential that we feel EPA missed the mark on. So in summary on the MSGP, we are a member of the Federal Stormwater Association, and that association, along with the Federal Water Quality Council, met with EPA, again, virtually to discuss comments, a lot of which overlap with AAR comments. And, EPA has told us that they are considering our comments and will get back to us if they've got any questions. The Small Business Administration informed EPA that they should have held a Small Business Regulatory Enforcement and Fairness Act, or SBREFA panel, for the rulemaking, and they didn't. And that's a requirement when you have a major impact on small business. So what they're suggesting is that they just readopt the 2015 permit requirements over the next 5 years while they have a chance to study what has been proposed and all the response to comments. Going on to some additional issues, you've heard me talk about the hazardous secondary material rulemaking quite a few times in the past. We did file a petition for rulemaking back in December of 2018 with several other associations to remove the contaminant comparison criteria and the design to burn criteria for boilers with respect to creosote treated and creosote-borate treated railroad ties. And we also, some of our coalition partners wanted to address paper recycling residuals as part of that petition. So far, EPA has not acted on that petition, but there has been a change in personnel over at EPA. There's a Tracy Yatagi is the new EPA head at in that office. And she originally told us that they would have our comments or our petition adopted into a rulemaking or a proposed rulemaking by the end of this year. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, that has slipped a little bit, and it looks like it's going to be spring of next year before that happens. And that is hard to say, depending on what happens in the election and potentially a new administration. There was some Georgia legislation to prohibit creosote or naphthenate treated wood ties in industrial biomass boilers that resulted as a result of a facility in a neighborhood. The neighborhood complained, got attention of some lawmakers. Ultimately, the governor signed that into law back in August. The representatives of the Georgia Renewable Power said that they plan on challenging the law in court on constitutionality grounds, but we haven't heard back from them as to whether they're going to continue to go forward with that. I know our Railroad State Government Affairs people have been active in that initiative. A couple of other state issues that we've been dealing with. California SB 68 was legislation that went up to Governor Newsom to continue to allow the disposal of used treated wood waste in low hazardous waste landfills, which is the way they are handled today. But Governor Newsom failed to sign that legislation. So, I know the railroads and us sent a letter to the governor, asking him to sign the legislation. He didn't do it. So, I think at this point in time, all we can do is to continue to advocate for new legislation. But, I don't see that happening before the requirement kicks in as of the first of the year. And another one is an Oregon called 1200Z stormwater permit. That permit is expanding permit coverage to all facilities, railroad facilities, not just where maintenance and equipment cleaning is done. So that would greatly expand the coverage of that permit. And it also adopts some of the tenets of what's in the 2020 draft multi-sector general permit, which we do not agree with. So we have put together, fairly detailed comments on that regulation also. California emissions has a lot going on. The transportation refrigeration unit regulation would have required facilities to have plugs to plug in either transportation refrigeration units on containers and trailers within 15 minutes. That would have required, a whole set of plugs out there in the intermodal yards. We proposed some alternative possibilities. Since then, Governor Newsom has signed an executive order to do away with, or I guess to quickly implement zero emitting equipment in California, which would basically negate the reason for this regulation. So as of a couple of weeks ago, they basically announced plans to remove that requirement, which would have been very onerous. California Air Resources Board also has recently introduced concepts to reduce emissions from locomotives and rail yards. There are four basic tenets of that. One is to establish a locomotive emissions reduction spending account. That account would be applied, or you would be basically taxed or charged for locomotives that didn't meet the latest, Tier 4 requirements. And then would put that money into a spending account, which you could use to buy Tier 4 locomotives. It's a very strange concept. They also have an in-use locomotive remanufacture limit, whereas today you can remanufacture locomotives many times. They would limit it to one time, unless it was a Tier 4 locomotive. They also plan to adopt EPA's 30-minute idling limit and be able to enforce that, and have some sort of repurposing of genset locomotives after use by Class 1 locomotives. There's a public meeting going on Thursday and Friday of this week, which we plan on being, participating in. And their ability to actually, their authority to do this is questionable. So if it comes down to it, we could end up in a court battle. There's also an advanced clean truck initiative, which basically is starting to require trucks to go to zero emission requirements. It started in California, but other states are endorsing that concept. So we're a little concerned about what that might lead ultimately to the railroad industry. And finally, as you know, we have our environmental award program. Earlier this year, we had the Chapey Award, and back in April, we awarded the Chapey Award to Corey Davis of CSX for his work to improve fuel efficiency in rail operations, reducing CSX's fuel usage by nearly 60,000 gallons per day. Very significant, using different technologies to accomplish that. And then the professional award is going to be presented before the break tomorrow. So you'll be hearing more about the professional award tomorrow. And that is what I had to say. And I'm ready for questions.
Bob, thanks so much. I warned y'all that it was lightning rounds with Bob. Any one of those topics could be a full-blown presentation, obviously. I don't see any questions, Bob, but I do have one for you. You didn't say anything about LNG being carried as a commodity. What's the latest on that? Do you know?
Well, yeah, that's actually one of my issues. And there was a final rulemaking authorizing LNG and tank cars in July. And that is in effect. But having said that, there has been challenges to that rulemaking. And, I guess I don't know that the rule has been stayed, but I know that there's been at least a couple of court challenges to the rule. So there's more to be, said about that. Also, the Transportation Research Board has a committee looking at rail transportation of LNG. And I don't know why they would do this, set this committee up after the rulemaking has been finalized, but they did, and it's an ongoing process. So we'll have to see what happens with that.
All right, thank you. We did have two questions just sneak in under the wire. I know we're short on time, but Jessica Johnson asks, if EPA goes forward with analytical requirements for Sector P, how soon do you envision other states incorporating that into their permit programs?
Well, I think that's why we weigh in very heavily, even though EPA only, I guess that permit from a national standpoint only covers about 13, 14 states. I mean, the fear is that once the states see it, they're going to adopt it. So, that's why we filed the comments.
I completely agree with that. That's going to be a challenge. There's a couple of more questions that have come in, but Emma, I think for the sake of time, how do you want to handle these?
Bob, I'll send them to you offline, and you can address them there if that's okay.
That sounds good. Get back on time.
Bob, thank you so much. Again, lightning round is value added as usual. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And you look good.
Again, the most dressed up I've been in 7 months.